fill me with sighs, sweet sighs, for sad goodbyes. One day I'm gonna say, stay, oh darling, stay. I stand by your side and the world opens wide when I look and I see in your face a vision so clear with a promise so dear. I know that there will be a place where a melody flows and a sweet softness grows like a flower that perfumes the air, bringing love that can heal. A kaleidoscope wheel can spin us away if we dare, but time is still prevailing.
1978. Stephanie unlocked her seatbelt and stood up in the aisle of the aircraft. Another 2 hours before they landed in Ireland, and she was feeling the stiffness that had started to set in. At 50, she was healthy and in good shape, constantly taken for 15 years younger than her age. No hair going grey, no wrinkles, or the dreaded cottage cheese thighs. But she was beginning to notice a change in her body here and there. A little less recovery after sitting for a while, a tiny drooping of some facial muscles. Nothing too drastic. She was remembering Peary and how she had made her laugh with her observations on aging. Well, the occasional gray hair or wrinkle I can handle, but it's what is coming that scares me. When your eyes disappear into your skull and your whole face folds in on itself. The only bright side is the 20-year rule. What looks horrible now looks fabulous 20 years later. Goldie added her scientific viewpoint. Just think of your face becoming like your brain. The way it develops a new fold for every bit of information you learn. Your face does that too. It's not attractive, maybe, but it's full of experience and knowledge. Like you're wearing a cerebral mass on the outside, she added brightly. Peary and Stephanie shook their heads. No. Giggling at the ugly imagery. Although it would make a good costume, Peary reflected. A mask of a cerebral mass. Ooh, scary. What would you wear with it, though? Stephanie took hold of the seat back as she stood and looked over the passengers, thankful her companion in the seat next to her was tolerably pleasant and not overly chatty. Wait till I'm really old, she thought, and irritable with everybody and annoyed by everything. She laughed, and then realized with a shock that she was almost the same age Tep had been when she met him. She did a few leg stretches beside her seat and rolled her neck around, smiling as she remembered how Tep used to comment on the physical regime that she quickly ran through in the mornings. How when she moaned with the release of her muscles, he said, "You shouldn't do that with anyone but me." She liked his mock ownership of her, even though her mother had taught her to be adamantly opposed to male ownership in general. Unlike Peary and Goldie, she had never married, and had always enjoyed her independence. Goldie, at the beginning the most independent and anti-establishment one, had eventually given in to the tradition when her daughter was 10 years old, and was now happily coupled, while still very creative and active in her field. Peary got divorced after 18 years of marriage, when her 2 lively sons had become more independent. When we decided to open our marriage, we suddenly saw this open door, and we decided we wanted a long, solitary walk, she laughed. Peary and Tom, both still working in theater, had remained good friends. Stephanie thought of the carousel of married love and mused to herself, "That's a ride I avoided. Perhaps I saved myself some expense and aggravation." As she sat back down, she tried to look out the small window from where she was, but the sky was all clouds. So she got out her Gaelic notes to review the poetry she had been studying in Toronto. She loved the Irish way of expression and had decided to visit Galway to take a few more courses over the summer. She looked at the poem written by Sean O'Riordan, Ad Lachach Mawahar, about the burial of his mother. She imagined the sound of the spoken words, so guttural and full of emotion, and a proud grandeur at the same time. There was a dignity to the language that Stephanie loved, a connection to nature. Words seemed to come up from the very soul of the earth. And in other works she'd read, there was a humor that was like no other. Memories of Tep's stories about his first love, Ariadne, came back to her, the girls dancing, and her family that had traveled from Ireland so many years before. Maybe I'll look up the Cavans in that little town he mentioned. Tournafulla, in Limerick, I think. That's not too far away from Galway, and it will be on my way to Kinsale. She was going to take the ferry from there over to Roscoff in France, and meet briefly with Madeleine, sister of her one-time lover in Paris, Luc. He was married now, with 3 beautiful daughters, all of them good in math, like him. Stephanie leaned her head back, numbers and years dancing in her mind, and she began to think again of Tep, of the time he had told her that at first sight he had thought she was Ari. Her thoughts drifted to dreams she had, in which she'd traveled to places that seemed so familiar to her, where she knew and loved people so well. That little girl and boy by the lake. She thought of dreams she had had of Tep over the years, dreams of their reunions, of being with him in California, or driving with him and planning a trip to New Orleans. In every dream, they were so delighted to be together again. In every dream they said all the things that had been unsaid when they were together. In a way, her dreams were like the words in a song Tep could have written. Just like he said he would do, she murmured to herself, as her eyes closed. She drifted and seemed to be dancing with him when he was very young. As they waltzed by a window, she looked out, thinking that she had heard someone call, "Jackie, wait!" She floated underneath some green water, felt his hand in hers, and saw him smiling as the light seemed to get brighter. She woke up when the flight attendant tapped her shoulder to ask her to buckle up for landing. "1958. "I love this," said Ilona, her head craning up to the Chrysler Building. "It is so astoundingly gorgeous. I'm in awe of the mind that had the vision to create this. It's exquisite. I dream someday of designing structures that can live on for years like that and give such pleasure. Did you know it was the first building in the world to be over 1,000 feet tall? That was in 1930. What I never realized, though, until I began my architectural studies, was that in 1916, with so many tall buildings and skyscrapers already in the city, there was a zoning resolution passed here in New York, which required new buildings to be set back, and the towers to be only a percentage of the lot size, so that sunlight and air could get into the streets below. They had taken the subway down from her apartment to Columbus Circle, where Stephanie looked at the giant billboard, as she always did, recalling the movie It Should Happen to You, about the girl who put her name up on it just to finally make a name for herself. Then they walked across 57th to Lexington Avenue and down to 42nd Street, where the Chrysler Building rose to its stately height. Tep followed her gaze to the top of the building and smiled at her, feeling a pride in her vision. "It will happen to you. You don't even need the billboard," he said. "You will create fabulous buildings too. You are destined to a love of beauty and harmony." "It's true," she answered. "My father gave me that appreciation, and now I look for it everywhere." And to herself she thought, "It's what I see in you, beauty and harmony, and why I love you." She thought it, then was suddenly overwhelmed by her own feelings, unable to tell Tep, to match her spirit to the huge one she saw in him, to believe herself equal. Her shyness annoyed her. After all the times they had been together, she still sometimes felt out of place, like she had before they met. And feeling as she did, she mutely tugged closer to his arm to bring herself back to him. He looked at her and gave her a peck on the cheek, and they continued walking. Tep picked up the story he had been telling her. "And so I thought Teddy was playing up at that World's Fair in New York. This was 1939. We had traveled up to see him in Betty Goodman's band there, but he'd quit the band to form his own group, and they were up at the Golden Gate Ballroom in Harlem. Man, I loved Teddy's playing. It was so sophisticated and elegant." Tep had a way of bouncing a bit as he walked, especially when he got excited. And he always got excited when he talked about the piano players he had known and listened to. He bounced as he and Ilona walked. They were on their way to an afternoon film. Tep had been able, for the first time ever, to talk her into playing hooky from her job that day, and they were off to the Roxy Theatre to see An Affair to Remember, circling back along West 50th. As they made a detour along a residential street, they looked at houses as Tep continued. "All those players were so amazing. Besides Teddy Wilson, Art Tatum, Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller, big guys, Count Basie, Earl Hines, George Gershwin, of course." He stopped for a moment and pointed delightedly at the sunflower growing out of the edge of the sidewalk. She had told him one time about her friend Peary's likening her determination to, and her own admiration of, such plants, and their unexpected celebration of life. Tep bent down, and Ilona wished she had a camera to capture his rakish brown hat and matching chocolate shirt curved over the plant, his long fingers delicately touching the eager yellow bloom. He jumped up and began again. "Did you ever hear of a guy called Eddie Haywood? Actually, there were two of them, senior and junior, both pianists. Daddy Haywood played with a lot of blues and jazz artists in the 20s and 30s. Ilona had her arm linked in his as they strode along. She was reveling in his stories as much as in the thrill of being delinquent in her duties at work. A bad girl at last, she chuckled to herself. Peary would have been proud. She hurried to keep up with Tep's pace. He was describing one of the singers the senior Haywood pianist had worked with, a woman named Sippy Wallace, her amazingly powerful voice, and some of the tunes she sang. Sippy didn't believe in using a microphone. She didn't need to. Her voice just took off when she let it loose. She had a song called Women Be Wise, and she tells women, don't advertise your man. That is, if you want to keep him to yourself. I'd like to hear her sometime if you have a recording, Ilona said, even as she silently thought that keeping Tep to herself was not an option she had. As always, she didn't dwell on that thought. Instead, she breathed in deeply and swung Tep over to the curbside, "Look," she said. "Another crazy escapee from the earth." She indicated a fledgling oak sprout growing out of the curb. "How do they do that? Where are its roots coming from?" "It's life," said Tep. "It beats all odds. Just like music with its roots so deep in us that it comes out anywhere it can, if we let it. Even if we're miserable and hopeless, if we just listen to music, it helps. And if we're actually a performer, it's like magic how something in your mind just opens up and lets the most amazing creations happen. I remember playing one time and losing all sense of myself and my body, even the piano. It seemed like my mind was just coming out of my fingers, flying out there. It was an amazing experience, one that doesn't happen often. Of course, you have to practice a bit. Or a lot, like the stupendous Oscar Peterson. Hey, did I ever tell you about the time Ray Brown, Oscar's bassist, put little silver balls into the piano before they went on stage? They were touring Japan, because Oscar had loosened the strings on Ray's bass and Herb Ellis's guitar. Those guys were crazy, always playing tricks on each other, but so good. Tep became thoughtful again. "Life," he repeated, then thought a bit more. "What you have to practice, as much as scales or modes or riffs, is just putting yourself in the space of wanting or loving music, of just opening your mind to the possibilities of music that are out there, to creativity." "I understand that," Ilona said. "I think it must be the same for any artistic or creative endeavor. When I study what other architects have done, and the principles of the craft, as well as really look at and see the natural beauty and structure of things, and then just let it all percolate in my mind, great ideas result. You have to be a little daring, though, and not afraid to take some risks." "Exactly," said Tep. "Either that or be born with genius genes. Or be born again, as in a reincarnation of, say, Beethoven or Michelangelo," Ilona said. "Reincarnation, yeah, I believe in that. Why not? Anything's possible, and who knows? Maybe we knew each other in earlier lives."
A game of love.
They arrived at the Roxy, and just inside the lobby, Ilona felt a little push on her arm, and turned to see Andy, a workmate, grinning at her. "Hi, Ilona," he said, through a mouthful of popcorn. "Oh, hi, Andy." And then, Tep, this is Andy. He works in my office." Andy juggled the box of popcorn under his arm and extended a hand to shake Tep's. "So," he said, studying Tep intently. "Nice to meet you." Tep had noticed Andy's scrutiny of him and answered, "Yeah, likewise." He looked at Ilona, who was smiling at both of them, and added, "We better get our seats," taking her arm. As they looked over the theater for places, Tep asked, "So who is he?" Ilona was startled by a tone she'd never heard him use, and said, in a tone she had likewise never used, "I said he's a co-worker. Didn't you hear me?" Tep took a minute before responding, as they climbed past the knees of couples already seated. "Well," he said tersely, "you were giving him a pretty happy smile. I just wondered. But I guess I can't expect that you wouldn't be seeing others when I'm not here." Ilona was hurt and confused by this untypical behavior, particularly after the good afternoon they had shared, and especially since she had absolutely no interest in Andy. Mostly she was angry at the attack. She didn't even want to answer what to her was an accusation, but her anger won out. She threw her sweater down on the seat and looked at Tep. "You're right. You absolutely can't expect anything from me when you go home." They sat down to watch the film, a distance between them for the first time ever. Ilona was quietly steaming as she tried to absorb and understand what had happened. "I smile at people," she said finally, through tightened lips. "That's who I am." And she pulled her sweater around her. After the first 10 minutes of the film, Tep whispered his apologies and lay his open hand on the armrest. Ilona took it in hers.
There's a silence that stops me as I go down the street. All the cars have passed by, and the bird song is complete. And the rose rays of sunset, they make everything sweet. I'm walking my blues in this gold. In that one quiet moment when everything is still. That's finally an end. Finally an end to the voices so shrill.
1959, in June. Ilona had her head buried in a file she was working on, turning her T-square onto one corner after another while she read. She had been given the opportunity to design a new project and was eager to do a good job, to produce something special. The magic of being an architect was getting it all right, having it be correct, which to her meant proportions and environment and function, not simply gelling, but being elegant too. Surrounded by her drafting papers, compasses, various marking pencils, and yet more files, she was going through notes she had made after a preliminary meeting with the client. She still had the zoning requirements of the city to review before she could even consider the overall materials and massing of the building. A library on the New Jersey shore, financed mostly by a donor. She was excited by the jumble of information in her head, but nervous too. Only 7 years to get here, she thought with some irony. Do it right. She looked at her desk calendar to check the time for the site visit, and added, "It's about time I had a break." "Absolutely right," said a deep voice leaning into her desk. Feeling her cheeks redden, Ilona realized with horror that she had spoken her last sentence out loud. She looked up reluctantly, afraid of seeing her boss, Jack Weaver, and then breathed her relief to see Andy Stewart West, a co-worker. Andy gave her a meaningful look and added, "It is about time. You work harder than a lot of people here. I personally think you should be moved up." He settled himself comfortably on the edge of her desk, absent-mindedly picking up a framed print she had there. It was a picture of an early model of a geodesic dome at Bennington College in Vermont, made by Buckminster Fuller. She had seen it in a magazine and been intrigued by the spherical form, so new and clean, and to her, somehow promising. "I'm not so concerned about moving up as I am about doing work that is challenging and new. I want a project I can bite into." "A biter," said Andy, raising an eyebrow and leaning in a bit more. "These quiet ones are so surprising sometimes." "Andy," Ilona said, closing her file, you are a nice guy. But I really have a lot of work to get done. My shopping list for this project, for one, of all the things I have to organize and keep in my head before I can begin sketching. Have you got nothing to do?" She looked up at him and smiled, wondering to herself why he was often hanging around her. He was tall, blond, and good-looking, but she had no interest in him. Even though he was a nice guy and sort of charming, there was something she couldn't put her finger on, some sense of him that she didn't quite trust. She had always been friendly, but just a little distant to his hovering habits. "Actually," he said, "I wanted to tell you about the company soiree. Well, not a soiree, really, just a bunch of us getting together in the bar down the street after work on Friday. But still, do you want to go?" He picked up a precision knife from the cutting mat, then smiled as he replaced it. Congratulations on this job, by the way. I might make it there, but this isn't a date, is it, Andy? You know, I do have a romantic interest already. Oh yeah, the musician. Is that still going on? I read he was married. An article about the Newport Jazz Festival he was at recently. Ilona sighed. Yes, he is. But we still see each other. Her phone rang, and Andy gave her a wave as he left her desk. After arranging the site visit with both the donor client and the city planners, she cradled the phone and thought to herself, yes, we still see each other, on occasion. She was unwilling to admit to herself how hard it was sometimes for her to continue in that role. She felt guilty, knowing how much she did care, and that Tep cared too, but every separation got more difficult. She wished she could tell him how she felt. She sighed again and picked up the phone to invite Peary and Goldie to the night out.
Talk, 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 talk all day. Yes, talk, 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 talk all day. Everybody's talking, they ain't got nothing to say. Sometimes I wonder just what the news is for. Yeah, sometimes I wonder what the news is for. 'Cause there ain't nothing that's new, it's all been done before. Well, all the people in the TV shows.
On Friday night, she walked over to Denny's. She spotted the big table at the back filled with her fellow workers. Andy waved to her, and she waved back and joined the group. Goldie and Peary had arrived ahead of her and were chatting with the others. "Beer?" Andy asked, "or wine?" "Can't decide. Too tired. Give me whatever you're drinking." "Nope," he answered. "If you're too tired to know what you want, then it's beer for you. A good, strong German one, ja?" "Ja, sehr gut," said Ilona, using the only German words she remembered from her high school days and a girl named Dory. She settled back, looking up and down the long table. At the far end, a sandy-haired guy was explaining something to the woman next to him, his hands forming a circle on the table in front of him. She'd never seen him at the office and looked at Andy questioningly. "Oh, that's Leo. He's a friend of mine. Called me up last night and wanted to get together, so I invited him to our little gathering." Andy watched as Leo made some circular hand movements. "He's a potter, probably demonstrating how the wheel works when he makes one of his bowls. He's very much a hand expressionist. You can tell by the way he waves his long fingers. Must have some Italian in his background." Ilona took a gulp of her beer and looked around some more. Ruth, one of the secretaries, was at the jukebox, going through the list of songs. She picked out an Elvis tune and looked around for a partner, giving her hips a little thrust and circle, and her fellow workers a look of aggressive daring. Ilona watched her and mused as she played with her beer glass. "Funny word, juke, isn't it? Wonder where it comes from." "I can tell you that," said Christine. "I just happened to have looked it up once for a music history essay I did in school." "And?" said Andy. "It's thought to be a corruption of a Gula word. The Gula people were originally from Africa, who eventually lived in the region of South Carolina and Georgia. The word started out as jug, which meant disorderly or rowdy, even wicked, and described some joints, places that were a little wild. The juke joints had automatic machines for selecting music, and they came to be called jukeboxes. And there you have it. History 505. Or it must be 5:30 by now. Christine toasted the group. "Thanks for that," said Ilona. "It's amazing, these little bits of information that we never knew. And to think that I might never have learned it. I like that word, jug." "Me too," said Dennis. "And I could use a little jugging myself." A collective groan went up in the group, and Dennis protested. It was a very loose definition. I think everyone is entitled to his or her own interpretation. Myself, I understand it as a kind of dance. Perhaps you would care to jug, m'lady? He stood and stretched his arm out towards Ilona. A Hank Williams tune, "My Bucket's Got a Hole in It," was playing. Ilona was on her second beer, and decided that she was enjoying the party after all. She got up to join him and let herself give in to the rhythm of the music. On the way back to her seat, she was intercepted by Leo, also inviting her to dance. "Someone in the crowd must like country music," he said. The next musical selection was Patsy Cline singing "She's Got You." Ilona looked over towards Andy, who nodded to her with a smile that was just a little too tight. Leo was interesting, soft-spoken, but intelligent and well-read. They danced next to Patsy Cline's slow tune "Crazy," and when the Platters started crooning "Harbor Lights," they stayed on the floor, taking the opportunity to talk without the wisecracks of the rest of the group. Leo told her about his pottery, and then spoke about some of his other studies, particularly his interest in the fourth way of Gurdjieff, a spiritual practice that has led him to yoga that focused on the mind more than the body. He seemed quite serious and thoughtful, and Ilona was impressed with his desire to be a good person. She imagined that he would always take the higher road. She was comfortable with him. He was a good dancer, too. She told him about her project, how her mind was racing with a million ideas at once, too fast for her to get them down. "I keep adding the tracing paper on top of each plan, trying what would work better. It's great fun, but a real challenge. I'm just in the development stage. I'll be having lots of meetings in the coming weeks with the various engineers, structural, electrical, mechanical, all that." She stopped as she saw Leo's smile. "I'm in awe of it," he said. "It's such a huge undertaking. I just build on my little potter's wheel, and if the clay falls over, I start over. No millions of dollars lost." She laughed. "Landscapers, too," she said, as they both headed back to their seats while the Bobettes started singing, "1, 2, 3, hey! Look at Mr. Lee." They got back to the table just in time for the arrival, to cheers and raised glasses, of Jimmy Quigley, lately arrived in New York from Derry City in Ireland, and newest member of the firm. Jimmy was a talker and a great storyteller, and many chairs were pulled out for him in invitation, in anticipation of the regaling that always had the crowd laughing. One of the men stood him a drink, and then asked him, all innocence, "So, Jimmy, how's it going? Heard any news from your hometown?" with a quick wink around the table. "Ah, well, let me think now. Did I get a letter this week? I don't think so." A groan went up. "Oh, but just a minute now. There's myself telling lies and all. My sister Peggy sent a wee note," so she did. Some gleeful smiles, and they settled back in their seats, the dancing forgotten for the moment. Jimmy continued, "It's a colourful place, is Derry, full of life and misery and laughs. And drinking." He toasted his friends and took a drink. They waited. "And characters. Old Seamus Cole Spud was out apparently," Peggy said. "Wandering the streets again the other night, dragging his sack of potatoes and fighting off the mad ravings of Bridget the Midget." "Who's Bridget the Midget, Jimmy?" "Oh, she's the local heroine who sits in front of a shop daily and hurls her own slurs at the passing folk, brandishing her big stick and bashing at anyone who gives her trouble. No fears there. Bridget can take care of herself, little person that she is." Jimmy quaffed a few big gulps of his beer and looked around. Someone called the waiter and ordered him another. Ilona saw Peary scribbling on a piece of paper, taking notes for her store of theatrical characters. "Did she ever hit you, Jimmy?" asked Ruth, and then quickly added, "No, of course you didn't. You wouldn't be spending your time with street types, would you?" Jimmy laughed. "Ah, they're all harmless. They wouldn't really hurt a soul. They're just slightly separate from a lot of other folks. And God knows we're all crazy enough in our own way, too. There's Buck Barney and his toothless pet lion. He wanders around town a lot with that poor animal that couldn't bite a marshmallow, if they had such a thing in Derry, which they don't. Still and all, he's a permanent fixture there, well known and accepted, as they all are. Mickey the Devil, Paddy No Arse, Frankie, but nobody can say that, so he's Frankie Bad Word to everyone. And poor old Tipperary, so called because he lost his toes in the war, walks around on his heels all the time, so they mock him a bit with that name. Because he lost the tips, he explained, of his toes. The table was quiet, people thoughtful. Jimmy looked around and shook his head. There's a lot of poverty over there. This is the grand life here in comparison. The people are poor and many, but they make do, and they're strong. Someday, it's got to change. He put his empty glass down and stood up. I'll have more of a story for you next time. This was just a quick stop, but thanks for the dram. And he left them as quickly as he'd arrived, pulling his hat onto his head. Someone started the jukebox up again with Rosemary Clooney's Mambo Italiano, and a group got up and formed a line of dancers weaving around the room. When the party started to break up soon after that, Leo came by Ilona's seat and told her he was going to England for a while, asking if he could write to her. She said yes.
Crazy dreams all night through. The future's murky, but the past is too. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to. I think I need you. Every time I try to see, try to change my history, those crazy dreams return to me and say I need you. I seem to hear an answer whisper in the night, some lonely secret that's hidden from my sight. Bring the promise of a kiss.
October 1959. A few months had passed since Ilona's presentation to the firm had been approved, the building well on its way. Buoyed by her new status and respect, she was enjoying her life. Summer had been beautiful in the city, and now she welcomed the cooler days of early October. She walked past the shops and diverse areas of the city on her way to her office, with a happy little tune running through her mind, looking at posters for plays and movies. Gigi had won Best Picture for the previous year. An old poster was faded and half torn on a wall. She saw kids going to their schools, cabs stopping and starting, drivers yelling at pedestrians and other cars. As she went by a grocer's display of fresh fruit and vegetables, she spied some ripe tomatoes, and laughed to herself at the way her design concept had begun. Her tomato for lunch sitting on her desk, 2 smaller spheres of chocolate candies beside it, and the Buckminster Fuller framed print. She had leaned the chocolate balls against the tomato, one off-center from the other, and as she looked at that she thought, why not? It could be done, with one arch to form an entrance to the first small dome on the ground, then behind it another arch on the ground supporting the second dome above, and also behind, which leaned against the larger dome, last of the 3. The second arch also supported the flat roof on which the small top dome sat, the roof extending from the first entrance arch and attaching to the large tomato dome. There would be a space underneath the second upper dome, in between the first small dome and the large one, both situated on the ground, the flat roof creating a ceiling. There would be a garden built around the perimeter of this space, visible from inside the 2 ground domes. Inside, an internal staircase would connect the 2 smaller domes, and a passageway would allow entrance from the top small dome into the larger one where they met. The large dome would have another, wider staircase to attain both the passageway and its second story. This second level was an open ring around the outside circular walls, contained by railings and supported by more arches from the floor. All the domes would thereby be airy and open spaces, each with shelving below windows that encircled the structures. Ilona had placed a central fountain in the center of the large dome, and had received praise for her design, and for her work with all the parties involved. She walked along, happy, realizing that she had much for which she could be thankful. She enjoyed her life, and in the 7 years since she had started working at the firm, the city had increased its hold on her, still bursting with all the life that had seemed so bright and promising when she was first on her own. She had taken advantage of the life, going to all the films and theaters and music spots she could, with Tep and with friends, and sometimes on her own solo adventures, which often included walking in Central Park and sampling eateries. She had made it to the boathouse, even to Gallagher's for steak as a special treat. She liked Tom's luncheonette, and the little greasy spoons that looked a little dodgy, but always had great food. She savored it all, as she remembered how she had stopped at the door of the firm's building, savoring her new position. New York still gave her a thrill, and New Yorkers did too, always finding a way to survive and make life happen, as crazy as it could be at times. She felt good, and her happiness grew with the thought that Tep was going to be back that night, playing at the club that always booked him. She always kept tabs on the listings so she would know when and where he was in town. She would go to see him, tell him of her success at work, small compared to his successes in the music world, but huge to her. Her life was so different from his, but it was hers. It had been 5 months since they had seen each other, and she had missed him, as always, even upset herself with feelings of hopelessness one time, so that she began a letter to him saying that in spite of how much she loved him, words she had never dared to speak aloud to him, she felt that she had to go on her separate way, find someone with whom she could share each day. She read her words and laughed at herself, ripping up the letter, weighing up that unknown future of fantasy with the reality of someone whom she knew she loved. She waited for him, as she always did, and now he was back. As she walked, she thought of the letter that had come from England, sitting unopened on her hall table, waiting for her, like a silent and knowing companion who just quietly bides his time for when you need a friend. But what would I tell Tep if I started to see someone else? She asked herself. She entered the familiar building and rode up to her place of work.
If you lie to me, listen, darling, if you lie to me, you're a fool. I won't stick around for that kind of trashing. If you lie to me, you'll find that life can be cruel. Well, if you make up reasons why you can't see me, if you think you're cool and I don't catch on, if you tell me stories to deceive me, you better know that I'm as good as gone. Well, maybe you've had other women who didn't get around. Maybe you think 'cause I love you like I do, I'll be some kind of slave that you can put down. Well, I'll be a slave for love, but never to you. So if you have to have some other woman.
She saw him within minutes of entering the half note. Tep was in a small group of friends and fans, laughing and chatting with them all before the band got on stage. He spotted her and came over with a couple of strides. His eyes looked warm and mysterious, his hair slightly longer and casual, and his face reflected to her the bright enthusiasm that he always seemed to exude. She knew she was smiling like a little kid as he approached. "Hi," she said stupidly. "Hi yourself," he said, and smiled at her. Then he paused, glanced around the room, and said quietly, "Look, tonight," and he paused again and looked apologetically at her. "Tonight you'll have to be on your own." Ilona heard the words, The message registered somewhere deep inside herself, with a sound surprisingly loud, like the roar of logs burning in a fireplace that looked out of control, except for the glass door holding back the licking flames. Outwardly, she kept on smiling, just like she smiled on that first night he came over to her. Only this time, in her mind, she played the past differently. She had been right. He hadn't been coming to talk to her. He was going to go past her table to greet someone else. How foolish she was to have imagined that he had asked to sit with her. As on that first night, the inward stream of thought happened in a hair's breadth of a second, almost before Tep had finished speaking. Her cruel imagination, so quick to put her down, was running away with this banner of hopelessness streaming behind, fluttering in the air like a kite's tail, matching her heart's sad spiral. Outside of Ilona's head, in the real world, Tep was still looking at her. No time had passed, but his band members were calling to him. He gave her a little smile and went to the stage. Ilona saw a woman smile at him from a table just below, and felt her stomach flip with insecurity. "No," she said to herself, still managing to look interested in the evening's proceedings. "I'm not leaving. I'm staying right here and listening to this wonderful music, as I always do. And I'm going to enjoy it." She toyed with the napkin on the table, took another sip of her beer, and looked around the room at the other patrons, some of whom she had met through Tep. And then she listened, one note at a time, following the melody on the piano, then on the guitar, then on the bass. She heard the variations on the solos, stopping in her mind for each movement up or down the scale, and seeing the constructions that were being created, taking comfort in the connection she felt with each sound. She took it all apart, then listened again to the whole. She focused on the rhythm of the drums, on each crash or brush or flip of the sticks. She made the music her study, so that her mind was totally occupied, forcing herself to breathe deeply, breathing in a new part of herself. At the break, she considered staying, but decided she had done enough. She needed to help herself through this new situation, and she needed to leave. As she rose from her seat, Bill came over to her table, giving her the requisite kiss on the cheek. Bill and his wife were fans of Tep's from many years back. They had become friends to him, often inviting him over to their house. She'd been to their place herself one time when they hosted a small gathering there. "Ilona," Bill said, and she knew at once that Bill had had a little too much to drink. He grinned at her, his eyes squinting through his blurred vision, pulling his hands out of his pockets and giving her an awkward hug. "How are you, honey?" Before Ilona had a chance to answer, his wife Lee motioned them over. "Mama's calling us. Come and say hi." Ilona put her coat over her arm and went with Bill to greet Lee. "Hello, darling," Lee said to her, and gave her a peck on the cheek. Just as Ilona stepped back from Lee, the woman who had been sitting by the stage came up to them. Lee started to open her mouth, then shut it again, looking first at the woman, then at Ilona, before finally saying heartily, "Lisa, meet Ilona." Then, turning to Ilona, she indicated with her arm and said, "This is Lisa, Tep's wife." Ilona looked at Lisa, smiled, and nodded. Then she took her coat from her arm and said, "You'll have to excuse me. I was just leaving. Early call on the job tomorrow. Good night, Lee. Night, Bill. See you another time." Then she turned and walked towards the door. She flipped on the light switch when she got home that night and stood for a while looking around her apartment. The file for her latest project was sitting on the coffee table in the living room. A little bouquet of tulips sat on the kitchen table, yellow and red and orange. Her morning mug and juice glass had been left on the counter, and in the bedroom she could see the glow-in-the-dark hands of her alarm clock and a book on the bedside table. It was 11 o'clock. Hanging up her coat in the hall closet, she spotted the letter from England. She walked to the hall table, picked up the envelope that had lain there for a couple of weeks, waved it in the air a bit, and then opened it. "I'll be back in New York by October 15th, Leo had written.
When I'm feeling lonely, when the time has been too long, when the whole world is busy, but there's no one singing me a song. Ooh, that's when I get to thinking, yeah, I'm thinking about Mr. Wrong. I've been waiting for too long, I gotta give in to sorrow. Because the feeling is too strong, I guess I'll have to start again tomorrow. But right now I know it's right. I'm gonna love my Mr. Wrong.
Andy opened the door of the restaurant for Ilona and made a mock bow to let her enter. She nodded her thanks and looked around at the decor of the place as she walked in. The room was cozy, furnished simply with round tables and checkered cloths, plus little candles giving the room a soft glow. The walls had large scenic murals of places she assumed were famous spots in Italy. The maitre d' greeted them with a smile and a questioning look, pulling the register forward on his table. "Stuart West," said Andy, and waited while the gentleman found his name, then grandly motioned for them to follow. She chose eggplant parmigiano, savoring every bite and alternating that with sips of her wine, while Andy tackled a huge piece of veal, eagerly quaffing his own drink. "You did a real great job on that library design." He looked over at her, turning his head a bit to the side and making his mouth into a yes-sirree scrunch, mirroring his forehead's frown and, she wondered, maybe his confusion at her success. Ilona thanked him and asked him what he was working on. He launched into his latest project, converting an older building to house a new section for air conditioning equipment, and then segued without stopping into a book he had read recently. Ilona noticed that he didn't really discuss the book as much as tell her a lot of detail. She would have liked to go into some of the points, but Andy seemed to like to talk a lot, and even when she did throw in a comment, he just continued on with what he had been saying, not connecting with her input. She finished her wine and sat back to listen, wondering about her decision to finally go out with him. He had been persistent, and his insistence on what a good person he was and why she should date him, although sounding too much like a salesman's pitch, came after the unsettling evening at Tep's gig and the fact that she had heard nothing from him since. So she decided to give Andy a chance and spare herself the anguish of not knowing where Tep was. As the waiter cleared the table and took their orders for tea and coffee, she looked over at Andy and smiled as he started talking again. Her mind wandered to when she and Tep had seen Andy at the cinema, and how she had told Tep angrily that she smiled at people. That's how she was. Maybe she did do it too much. She guessed that Andy had taken her smile as encouragement to talk more. She fiddled with the spoon in her teacup, took a spoonful of tartufo, and sat back again to let him continue. They left the restaurant and found a little bar that was playing music she liked. Paul Desmond's Take 5, Morgan's Sidewinder, and some Mingus. Andy was being very solicitous of her wishes, trying to please her, and she appreciated that. She told herself to be patient with him. But they were there for only about an hour when Andy brought up the spate of anti-communism and the McCarthy proceedings just a few years earlier, declaring his support, and that roused Ilona to speech. In spite of the misery of her parents' experience with communism, she knew that the interrogation and blacklisting were sheer hysteria and wrong. They argued, and very quickly the evening deteriorated, as she saw how far apart they were on that subject, and also in their thinking in general. She looked across the table at Andy. He was wearing a dark blue suit that had a very good cut. He looked good in it, and he argued with conviction. But she was bothered by his lack of understanding of the wrongs that had been perpetrated, his inability to see the injustice. She couldn't help comparing his conviction, which came across more as anger, to Tep's passion, which to her had always been born of joy. She was disappointed, and thought to herself that a relationship between them would never work. When they reached her street and building, she decided to be honest rather than prolong any hopes, and told him that she appreciated the night and him as a co-worker, but that she wouldn't see him again.
Sweet notes of music, the magic is happening, it floats through the air, and it catches my soul, and the problems all seem to be disappearing under its spell. The lovely, lovely sound is going round and round. All of my life it has spoken so much to me, bringing me back to a place that I know. No matter how much I am wandering lost, it harkens me home when the lovely, lovely sound is going round and round. I close my eyes and I hear music dancing around my head, calling me, teasing me, healing me, easing me. I am alive and I am led.
Andy sulked around the office afterwards, in spite of Ilona's determination to be friendly. But when he heard that she had seen Leo a few times, he avoided her, and she decided that was for the best. Leo had contacted her on his return to New York, and they had met for lunch a couple of times. Ilona was relieved that the pressure that she had felt from Andy, even though unspoken, was not there with Leo. He was interested in her, but it was precisely that, the fact that he was actually interested in her, that made the difference. He didn't try to win her over or impress her. He was comfortable with himself, and interesting, as he had been on that first night when they met and danced together. On their third outing, they had decided to go to an art opening of a friend of his, and were on their way to the gallery when they passed a little shop that Leo knew. "Do they sell your pottery there?" Ilona asked, noticing the clay pieces displayed in the window. "I love the soft glaze on that beautiful bowl in the center." "No, I've never sold anything there, although I should talk to them about it. I'm only ever in the back room for some meetings I go to." "Like the bad guys in the movies? Gambling illegally? I'm surprised. You don't really look the type. But then, you never know." Ilona giggled as she thought how unlike Leo it would be. She never quite figured out his cheerful seriousness. "You might be surprised. Some people think that what we do is kind of spooky and a little on the freaky side. It's too unreal for them, not something they can see or understand." And he went on to explain that he met with a discussion group to study spiritual ideas of personal growth, in particular the ways of the teacher Gurdjieff. Ilona was very curious, especially when he spoke of etheric bodies and energy and magnetism that people possess. They talked a lot about it, and about the yoga that he practiced. It's called Raja Yoga, and it focuses on the mind more than the body. It's very important to make your mental focus and purpose clear and positive, he said. And then he added, and good. He was unabashed about speaking so plainly and simply about goodness, something Ilona found refreshing. They got to the gallery. Leo introduced Ilona to Daisy, the artist, and they spent the evening looking at her work, meeting other artists and art lovers, and nibbling on the food. Leo didn't drink alcohol, she discovered, but Ilona had no problem accepting a glass or two as she wandered around the room. It was refreshing, not only to see the artwork, but to be involved with a different circle of people. She looked at one painting for a while, trying to decipher the content and message, and decided that it didn't matter. She liked the colors and form. She turned to see Leo studying her with a smile on his face. "Do I look so funny? Can you tell I don't know which way is up?" She put a goofy look on her face. "I just like looking at you being so intense and curious. You know, there's dancing in the other room. Shall we?" Courtly. That's what it is, Ilona thought to herself. He reminds me of a Renaissance gnome sometimes. Courtly and mischievous somehow. But I like him. She was aware of a physical pull.